If it's an important topic
Let's do it.
to all of us, and we
Okay.
want to develop it here, let's do it.
So in our previous presentation, we showed that on an absolute basis, with all the different peers we pulled together, the funds were performing below the median, not only in the peer group, but in the PPD universe. That was on an absolute basis, and we were cognizant and acknowledged the challenges of doing an absolute basis performance analysis. Here, we have attempted to highlight risk-adjusted performance measures for the two plans. Risk-adjusted performance provides an effective comparison of total active management for different strategies and allocations. The two measures we calculated for the plans are the Sharpe ratio, measures risk-adjusted performance against the risk-free rate, and the information ratio, measures risk-adjusted performance against a benchmark. We calculated Sharpe ratios and information ratios for PSERS and SERS from publicly available data beginning in 1988. We constructed multi-asset benchmark portfolios using total return indices for comparison to the pension plan returns and to measure the information ratios. The benchmarks compounded monthly data to provide annual returns compatible with annual plan norms. No management fee is included on the benchmark indices, but we could assume that this might be a 10 to 15 basis point management fee, and so the benchmark returns could be, in our final paper, discounted by this amount for comparison. It must be noted that the data for doing risk-adjusted performance analysis can be challenging to obtain because of the insufficient frequency or shorter time period of, especially of the private market investments and the marks that they provide. They are infrequent, and the mark-to-market pricing is limited. The limited frequency of fair value pricing of private market funds also creates a lower risk illusion for the fund. The greater the exposure to private market funds, the more likely that observed total fund return risk is understated. So, all that being said, this is the data on PSERS. The three benchmarks that we used, can you hear me? Yep. The three benchmarks that we use to measure the performance of the two funds against include a U.S.-based portfolio of 60% equity, 30% fixed income, 5% real estate, 5% cash. We have a global balanced 60-40 mix of equity and bonds optimized for mean variance to the efficient frontier. The PSERS Global is a mixture of public indices that match the most recent asset allocation policy of the plan. We also have an LDI portfolio, as PSERS uses a leveraged LDI portfolio that has longer duration assets on fixed income and higher allocation to commodities and real estate. From the table, we can see that the 30-year Sharpe ratio for PSERS is slightly lower than all the alternative balanced benchmarks, but the 10-year Sharpe ratio is 2/3 of the global balanced portfolio, reflecting more than a 2-to-1 ratio of risk to return in excess of the risk-free rate, despite a higher than average exposure to bonds. The near zero information ratios over the 30-year period and negative values over the 10-year period versus the 60-35-5 and the global balanced portfolios reflects that PSERS has underperformed various simple multi-asset index portfolios. This confirms the performance measures from our previous presentation, the absolute numbers. From the charts, we observe the Sharpe ratio over the first half of the period was much higher than the second half of the period, as total fund risk has nearly doubled. The blue line is the fund's Sharpe ratio and risk levels for the entire period up till that point, whereas the red line is a rolling 10-year value at any given point. It is interesting to see that the fund risk of PSERS is stayed at high levels over the last 10 years, despite their allocation to equities decreasing over the financial crisis. On SERS, the 30-year Sharpe ratio is slightly lower than the alternative balanced benchmarks constructed, but the 10-year Sharpe ratio is 2/3 of the global balanced portfolio, reflecting a 2-to-1 ratio of risk to return in excess of the risk-free rate. The negative 10-year information ratio versus both the 60-35-5 and global balanced benchmark portfolios reflects that SERS underperformed other alternative policy mixes on a risk-adjusted basis by more than the fees of using simple liquid indices. we used a 15 basis point discount to returns. Similarly to PSERS, the fund risk has generally increased over the period and Sharpe ratios have declined. However, we do see fund risk declining and Sharpe ratio increasing at the end. The context. In summary, the analysis here has shown that both plans historically have not performed as well on a risk-adjusted basis against a simple balanced public indices as indicated by their negative information ratios over the 10 and 30-year period. The overall risk of both funds has increased over the time period looked at, despite general market volatility increasing. The Sharpe ratios of both plans over the 10-year and 30-year period are very low. However, the values over the last 5 years have, in fact, been better. For PSERS, it would appear that the larger allocations to liquid asset classes away from public equities and the use of leveraged and fixed income were problematic. SER's allocation to private equity does not seem to have benefited them very well, although we note that their allocation to global public equity has meant that their performance has been better than PSER's. So, with the context of the ingredients, the governance, and the performance, it seems to me there is a case to be made that we should do something. We do believe there are certain cost-saving strategies that are not appropriate for the PA plans because they do not appear to have the governance required to adequately monitor them. We do not think that increasing internal management or innovation is advisable until such a time that the governance of the plans can be brought into line with the complexity of the portfolios that are currently being managed. You saw the power of internalizing earlier in my ingredient slides and the ability to dramatically cut costs by doing things like seeding managers or launching platform companies. I only hope those figures are enough to give you the courage as a commission to take on the governance challenge and move your funds into alignment with your peers in South Dakota, Wisconsin, and Florida to establish an expert investment advisory council either within or under the supervision of the existing boards. In terms of cost-saving recommendations,
yeah, I just have a quick question on governance. It is quick.
I'm almost
To get the kind of professionals that you're talking about to serve on an investment board,
Yeah.
okay, it's obvious to me you're talking about a paid board.
It doesn't need to be. In the state of Wisconsin, they're volunteer. They're volunteer professionals that just want to give back.
That'd be terrific if we could find that. I have some concerns about that.
You have concerns about a volunteer board?
No, I just have concerns that we get the right people to volunteer to do this. I guess out of 12,500,000 people, we could probably find a few.
I think you'd be shocked at how motivated people are to work and help this system. I think everybody in this room would probably put their hand up. Final recommendations, and then I'll turn it over to Marcel. In summary, based on this analysis that we've carried out, which I acknowledge has been a little bit abbreviated and without the full information that we might have liked to have had for a typical assessment of this kind, here are the recommendations that I would put forward to the Commission for their assessment. Recommendation number 1 is renegotiating and monitoring of current mandates. Good news is it sounds like the funds are already taking this seriously and moving in a strong direction. Without changing the asset allocation and risk levels of the current portfolio, renegotiations should take place along best practice guidelines. I'm not going to steal Marcel's thunder on this. He will help understand how you can get there and even get beyond the $1.5 billion in savings per fund. To me, that may be the most palatable pathway to achieve the objectives of the Commission. I am not a politician, and so I don't understand the politics, but that is something that I think everybody could probably get behind. Second recommendation, which I will begin by saying, again, I would ask the Commission to consider recommending a governance overhaul To do internal management or add innovation or complexity to the plans would require adding governance budget to meet and align with the risk budget. This might require legislation to change the composition of the respective boards or install underneath them an advisory board or an advisory committee to complement the representative function of the existing board with the necessary expertise. This is a path I would encourage, though I recognize it is difficult to enact at this time. So that leads me to the second formal recommendation. Given the governance budget of the two plans does not appear to be sufficient to take on more complexity or innovation right now, we recommend investigating, simplifying the investment strategies of the two funds. A move to simpler strategies such as active or active to passive or illiquid to public could be considered. This could not only reduce costs, but also help bring the governance budget of the plans in line with the level of complexity already contained within it. Consideration would have to be given to the active risk associated with these changes, as well as the extra short-term volatility that might come with moving to passive indices, for example. There's a reason why absolute return tends to have a role in a portfolio, and it's to mitigate volatility. If you remove all of that, be ready for more volatility. This concludes my portion of the presentation. I thank the Commission for their attention. I'll be taking questions, obviously, after Marcel. And Marcel, I'll get you set up. Team AV?
I think you need to. Yes, so thank you all for having me. Thanks for the microphone. This is an unusual format for me, so I'm not used to this kind of hearing, so apologies if I disrespect the protocol anywhere. I don't mean to. As Ashby has previously mentioned, this is not the typical work we would do. We see ourselves as mediators, essentially, between financial service providers and asset owners, such as pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and we're typically called in by asset owners, such as you, who need advice on how to maybe restructure and renegotiate the agreements that they have in place. And every investment, if you want to look at it that way, has a return, it has a risk, and it has a cost that is associated to it. And the only thing we would do is we would look at that cost component and essentially see whether we believe that from best practice perspectives or from arbitrage perspectives, looking at the global market, we think that there is opportunities to renegotiate those fees with the existing managers. So we would never advise someone to go from active to passive simply to save cost. That is not in our line of business. We would look at the existing contracts and try to help the asset owners to improve those terms for the ultimate benefit of the beneficiaries. So everything we're going to be saying today, please should be heard and read as a constructive input to help the plans and these commissions maybe position themselves in where we think they stand with their terms and agreements, and where we see opportunities for the plans to improve those terms. And we're more than happy to have a conversation with either of the plans to give them more detail and more in-depth maybe feedback, so that they can take this to the conversations with their managers. So, do you mind flipping those slides? Okay. I can see this is very small. So I also try to be a bit quick in the consideration of time, but essentially, Ash, if you don't mind moving to the executive summary slide. So, yeah, too fast, one more. So we were asked whether, from our experience of negotiating many contracts the world over, and we have a little over 60 clients, and they in total represent more than $2 trillion in assets, and we're essentially something like a procurement office for them, and they use us for the mediation of their terms. So we have a bit of experience, and all of our staff, we did go to these Harvard classes of negotiation, so we would understand what the counterparties would potentially try to bring to the table, and anticipate that, and of course be prepared for those discussions. And we were asked whether, from our experience looking at the information we were given, that there is an opportunity for the two plans to save 1.5 billion each. And the good news is we think there is an opportunity for both plans by renegotiating terms to actually achieve those savings. And I will come in greater detail later to where we think those lie. As I have previously said, our analysis is really focused on, I would call that, best practice procurement. So we're not giving any kind of idea or advice whether you should be with other managers or whether you should have a different allocation. That's not what we do. The only thing we do is we look at your allocation, your existing managers, those terms, and we try to compare them to terms we see elsewhere and best practice we see elsewhere to identify whether there is opportunity to create some savings. We also believe that the target being equal for SIRS and PSIRS, although both plans are different in size, is by definition a bit harder to achieve for SIRS than it is for PSIRS. We also recognize that SIRS already has a high passive allocation, which of course bears less room for renegotiation than an active allocation. One more thing, that just for the records, we have not been granted full access, or we have not received all the data we would have needed to do a full deep dive analysis. So we are very comfortable with the results we're presenting today, but they're also very limited to public equity, because we would have needed a lot more information to dive clearer into the other asset classes. I will come back to that later. So maybe as an executive summary, on SIRS, we see there are a few mandates. We've anonymized them, but I'm more than happy to share, of course, the details on those managers with the two plans. So we've identified essentially 4 mandates that we believe should be and could be renegotiated. We will later on also say to what levels we think they could be renegotiated, and based on what reason we think that should be achievable. But there's essentially 4 mandates we think that should be renegotiated. We've also heard from SIRS in the questionnaire that we have shared with them, some sort of a self-assessment. We've heard that there are most favored nation clauses in place, and we just wanted to make the point that most favored nation clauses from our experience don't guarantee best terms, and we see them, quite frankly, circumvented all the time. So there's lots of opportunities for managers and asset owners to actually find ways around most favored nation clauses, even if they're in place. And we realized that they've probably initially been a good idea from an asset owner's perspective, but over the time they've actually turned out to help the asset managers more than they help the asset owners. Because asset managers could now, no matter what the market does, they could keep their fees artificially high, hiding behind most favored nation clauses, and we would see that happening all the time. So just a word of caution here: most favored nation clauses don't mean that you actually have the best terms. And for PSIRS, we think that all the mandates in international equity small cap should be up for renegotiation, and we've identified 3 more mandates that we also think bear the potential to be renegotiated. One of them, funnily enough, is a mandate that SIRS has too, and despite that SIRS has a smaller investment with the very same manager and the very same mandate, SIRS pays lower fees than PSIRS. So we also think there is more opportunity for what is already been done by the plans to communicate with each other and bundle forces whenever that is opportunistic. Another thing we have learned from the self-assessment, and I've highlighted it here just briefly, is the fact that more expensive mandates do not guarantee better returns. It is the same the other way around. I mean, it's not because a mandate is cheap that it will be a good mandate, right? So it's kind of like the wrong measure to say a mandate is cheap or expensive, and therefore it is bad or it is good. But I think it's really important to make sure that whatever mandate you choose to be in, or whatever asset class you choose to be in, you try to pick the best terms that you can find with that manager or in that asset class, and you negotiate hard as a plan to find commercial terms that make sense for both parties. And I think it's important not to forget that all of these arrangements are ultimately commercial arrangements between two parties, and they should be seen as such. So moving on to the next slide, Ash, if you don't mind. I've mentioned that, no need to go into that further. We have not had all the data we would have wished to have. We could have maybe made a few more statements, but in broad it wouldn't have changed much the view that we have. Maybe to mention, on SURS we did not receive unredacted contracts, meaning that we didn't really see the terms that are signed. The terms that we have taken for our analysis are from a consultant report of SURS, but they represent average fees paid and not necessarily the actual terms signed. So it's difficult for us to say whether those terms would include performance fees or carried interest or whatsoever, simply because we don't have the access to that. Okay, thank you. So I would like to share maybe a few slides that are notable to share on the self-assessment that we have asked the plans to reply to us. And this is just an excerpt, and I'm kind of like pointing to a few areas that I think the plans have an opportunity to improve. And of course, there have been many questions that we have asked that have been answered favorably, and therefore, there is nothing that we would want to highlight because the plans are already doing it according to what we would perceive to be best practice. So if I'm highlighting here maybe the more negative examples, that doesn't mean that the total self-assessment has that much of a negative picture. It's really the ones that we think are noticeable to discuss and to bring the attention to the Commission. So we've asked both plans on a scale from 1 to 10, whether when 1 being the least competitive and 10 being the most competitive, where they would put themselves. And both plans have said, well, we would give ourselves a 10, meaning that they are the most competitive in the market, or that they have the most competitive terms in the market. And both plans have said that this self-ranking is based on the fact that they have most favored nation clauses in place. And I've mentioned that previously, that those most favored nation clauses actually are not a sign that you do have the best terms that are available in the market. And I'm just maybe opening up that bracket quickly again. I've mentioned before that they help asset managers more than they help asset owners. And in fact, we actually think that most favored nation clauses are more a bit a sign of weakness than they are a sign of strength, right? Because plans the size of SURS and PSURS, quite frankly, should be fee makers and not fee takers, and therefore they should enter the market, we believe, with a sign of strength, where really what others pay is not relevant. It's relevant what you're willing to pay for the assets that you're giving to managers. So next point is, we have asked both plans about the average age of the fee schedules in the portfolios, and both plans have said they don't track that. So we would highly recommend to track that, because it is our strong belief that if a fee arrangement is older than 3 years, it needs to be revisited, which is also part of the reason why we would recommend those managers for renegotiation that we have said earlier, or we will point again to later, because some of those contracts are 8 or 9 years old, and the market has, of course, moved a lot since, and they should definitely be revisited. So we would also recommend to the plans to start tracking the age of those fee schedules, and very diligently, whenever those are 2 or 3 years old, take it out of the drawer and bring it to negotiation. Next slide. So we have asked both plans on what percentage of their asset managers have confirmed in writing that they don't receive commissions or rebates or retrocessions or any other incentives associated with their investments. And PSURS has said that they do not maintain this information. SURS has said that it's part of their regular due diligence process. We would just like to highlight that this is an area of potential conflict of interest. So we believe it is very important to know whether the manager that you have employed has any other compensations than the one that you're actually paying to them. So we believe it's very important to track that and to be aware of any potential conflicts of interest that could be there, because they might have an incentive to earn money elsewhere. We have also asked the inverse question, so that managers would confirm if they are paying anyone commissions or introduction fees and so on. And PSERS, again, has said they do not maintain this information. SERS has said that it is, again, part of the due diligence process. Again, we encourage both plans to really stay on top of this, because we believe it is very crucial to have full transparency on whether out of the fees that you as a plan are paying to the manager, or in the incentive fees that they may be earning on top, whether any portion of that is going to a third party that you may not be aware of. We believe it's very important to have that information, and we therefore encourage the plans to regularly ask all of their investment managers to confirm both of those points to them in writing. Next. We have again asked the plans if their brokers are allowed to use a bundled brokerage, and to those not knowing what it is essentially an embedded research compensation that brokers would get through the transaction of an asset. So whenever they are charging a brokerage fee, there might be an element which is essentially for research, and the broker would charge that based on transactions and then allocate that research budget to your asset manager. So this is essentially an additional source of income, although it's called soft dollars because it doesn't typically flow as in hard dollars. An additional source of income for asset managers, and therefore again a conflict of interest because you believe as an asset owner that the full compensation your asset manager receives from you is from the management fees you pay to them, but that is often not the case. They may have other sources of income, such as research budgets that they do receive from bundled brokerage. And just as a side note, we realize that in the US and also in other markets, this is still very common. In Europe, this has been completely banned and is, in fact, since 2018, it has become illegal, because there is a big conflict of interest in that your manager might have an incentive to churn your assets more than necessary in order to create research budget for them, which pays for their Bloomberg desks and what have you. And that, of course, is a conflict of interest. Also because as an asset owner, you can never be sure whether the research budget that has been generated from your assets is actually also used for research for your assets, or whether it's just used for research for the firm, but maybe for different clients. So as a conflict of interest, and although we realize it's not banned or illegal in the United States, we would highly encourage to discuss that point with the asset managers, and also find ways to go away from bundled brokerage. And if the asset managers would complain about the research budget that they will no longer receive through that, then we think it is a lot healthier to agree to such a budget and pay it directly to the asset manager, other than to have it embedded in a transaction where you just don't expect it to be. So on the same note, we have asked whether the plans are doing a transaction cost analysis. And PSERS has said no. They have said they did do it in the past, but felt it was of not much use. We can understand that. These numbers are sometimes a bit cumbersome, complex. There's sometimes not much you can derive from it. However, there is, of course, also some indications that you could see from these reports, such as an example, closet indexing. For those not being fully aware of the term, that is when an asset manager is essentially more or less replicating the index, but is charging you active fees for a somewhat passive product. And you would see that kind of behavior from transaction cost analysis. So we would again encourage both plans to do a transaction cost analysis, and SERS have confirmed to do this on a quarterly basis. Next slide, Ash. So we asked both plans on what they believe is the single biggest hurdle why the terms could not be further improved. And both plans have mentioned that capacity issues with their managers is a concern. PSERS has additionally mentioned that the overhead with their managers is a concern. I would maybe quickly go on to the capacity side. We understand that some strategies are indeed capacity constrained, but we would also like to warn that capacity constraints is the single most used argument from asset managers not to enter into fee negotiations. We would also like to say that whenever we represent clients with smaller assets, we typically hear the asset managers tell us, well, if you bring more assets, we can give you better terms. And whenever we are speaking to larger plans, such as SERS and PSERS, then typically asset managers would tell them, well, we're capacity constrained. So the answer is often a capacity problem. Either it's not enough or it's too much, but it's really the single most argument, and we would just recommend the plans not to take the word for it without questioning it. And what PSERS has additionally said, PSERS has said that, and I'm gonna read this as a quote, not to do any unfair judgment here, but in traditional asset classes, the two greatest impediments are the need for the active asset manager to have a minimum amount of fees to cover overhead of the business, especially during years where performance may be more challenged. And we would like to highlight that both of these plans are very large, and both of the plans give intendants large allocations to asset managers. So we don't think that overhead should be an issue for the managers because they're making large fees. And even if it was, we don't think it's the pension plan's problem, right? So if a manager says, I need to make more money in order to run my operation, then I would highly question that. Right? Next slide. Sorry, there was one more. We have asked both plans if they have procurement guidelines in place. And I believe I've heard in previous statements today that those are actually being built up. And we believe those are very important, and they would allow for a structured and replicable process whenever a mandate is agreed upon. But they would also help, from our experience, the staff at both SERS and PSERS to actually negotiate harder with the asset managers, because whenever an asset manager is pitching for a new mandate and is looking for a new business relationship, that is the moment in time where there is the most flexibility to discuss terms. And if your procurement guidelines essentially don't allow you full freedom on what you're going to be paying them, then that will generally help the plan to renegotiate or to negotiate at that moment in time better terms. Okay. Next slide. So, being aware of time, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask you if we want to go manager by manager and give our recommendations and why, or whether we should just hand this over to the plans and be available for any input we can give them.
So thank you for your consideration on our time. Here's what I'd like to do, and I take full responsibility for allowing us to go over. I know you've come a great distance. If we could condense your testimony to what you believe is the most important, and certainly this information will be disseminated and distributed in the consultant's report. If we can just try and wrap this up in 15 minutes. So whatever order you think is most important for this commission to hear from you, I think we could expedite by moving forward with your recommendation.
Okay, thank you. We can do that. So I will be quick through those managers. They're anonymized anyway, but you will see here in gold, it's hard to read. It's a bit small. But essentially, the first manager, it's a 9-year-old contract. We think the fee is almost double as high as it should be. We think there's quite a lot of room here to renegotiate that. Then we have a passive mandate. We believe it's priced fairly. In general, I have to say the SERS mandates that are passive, the prices are quite attractive. So well done on those negotiations. We have another active mandate that we believe should be renegotiated. Almost half of the gross alpha has been, paid to the manager, and we've had that discussion before. How much of the alpha could go to a manager or a partner? and how much of that would be justified. And there's a general understanding that 20% is acceptable. However, in this case, it's been almost 50%, so we think that should be definitely renegotiated. There's 2 more passive mandates, both of them priced fairly. Would you mind? Another passive mandate priced fairly. Another active mandate, which we believe is too high. Again, on SURS, as a little side note, we haven't had unredacted contracts, so we don't know exactly what the terms are. We've only actually seen a number, and that number appears to be high. We would need to see the real terms to be able to give more of a statement. Next mandate, the same. We believe that the rate being paid is too high. There's an opportunity to renegotiate that mandate. And again, for the records for both plans, I think they would have my contact details from the presentation. I'm available at all times to give them more background to why we think and how we think they could renegotiate those terms. Yeah, next. So I'm not.
Could you mention the mandate numbers as you go through them? Because I'm lost now.
Sorry. Sorry. So, do you mind going back one page? Yeah. So we have a lot of passive mandates on this page. Those would be mandate 5 and 6 and 7. 5 and 7, and those are priced fairly. Whereas mandate 6, as an example, we have no contract details. So on this mandate 6, called SURS mandate 6, 99 million, which we believe might actually be in wind down. So it may not be that relevant. But we haven't seen any contractual details to that manager, so we just simply can't comment on the terms. Next. So I'm going to PSURS mandates, and I'm not going to go into the details of this, but I would like to mention something. We've previously heard that there is a plan to reduce the base fees and introduce higher performance fees, or there's been a discussion about whether it's carried interest or performance fees or whatever. And we've looked at some of the arrangements that seem to recently have been adjusted, and we believe that those will actually turn out to be more expensive in the future. So we would just like to raise a word of caution. We'll come to that later. Whenever performance fees are being introduced, those need to be, from our perspective and experience, they need to be negotiated very carefully, because they do carry a potential to actually increase the total cost of such a mandate. And in one specific example, if we look at data from the past, and clearly there's an indication it would have been more expensive in the past to be in that new fee schedule. So if the assumption is the manager is going to do equally well going forward, then that adjustment of the fee schedule was not to the favor of the plan, it was to the favor of the manager. So in the interest of time, I will want to go quick through this. On PSURS, we think that with various of the mandates, and Commissioner Bloom here, these are the PSURS active mandate 2, active mandate 3, and active mandate 4. We think that in all of those, there is potential to renegotiate those. We have given approximately where we think those tiers should be. Active mandate 3 as an example, and this is now the benefit of having contracts that are not blacked out. So here we had, for PSURS, we actually had the real contract. Thank you to PSURS for providing those. We could see as an example with the active mandate 3, despite it's over $1 billion in size, the top tier ends at 200 million. So the last fee reduction, in essence, that larger allocation would bring ends at 200 million. And this is probably some sort of a legacy thing, right? When the contracts were negotiated, the assets were probably not that big. It's an assumption I'm making. And the terms were appropriate at the time. And now we think that having a last breakpoint at 200 million for a 1 billion investment is just not appropriate. So we think there is room to renegotiate that as there is with mandate 4. Next. So I've mentioned before that we believe all the international equity small cap mandates bear room for negotiation. And I've also mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that a more expensive mandate doesn't guarantee better returns. And in this asset class here, we actually have that the living proof of that. So the cheapest out of the 5 mandates has actually been the best performing. So there's clearly room with the others to negotiate the fees, also because their performance has maybe been a bit disappointing, especially also compared to this active mandate 5, which is here listed at the top. So I've said before that we believe contracts should be renegotiated every 2 to 3 years. And in PSERS, I think there is an opportunity here to renegotiate the fees also because some of those mandates, and in total it's almost 30%, are older than 5 years. So there's definitely room here to renegotiate them. Okay. There's another interesting component, and I'd just like to highlight it for the benefit of PSERS to really look into this. We think that the high yield allocation is definitely different than we would typically see it. We would typically not see allocation to this asset class through a private market instrument like it has been structured here. So essentially this originally liquid asset class has been structured in an illiquid way, and from what we can tell, it hasn't really worked out. Of course, you're locking yourselves in. Of course, those terms, it's shorter than it would be on private equity, but you're still locking yourself in. So we believe there is also a problem from an asset allocation perspective. You're also, by going private and by locking yourselves in, you're of course also taking away flexibility to reallocate your assets between the different asset classes, because certain of those are locked in. So there's a certain amount that you can't move. And secondly, we think that the terms that have been agreed here for this investment are just very much in favor of the asset manager, and we would definitely recommend to PSERS that whenever this comes to expiry to renegotiate those terms. And maybe just to give a few words here, it really hasn't performed as well as I believe was maybe anticipated, and therefore has really not justified the fees. And if we take into consideration on the next slide, Ashby, the carried interest on top of what has been paid, then on the 10-year period ending, when is that ending? Give me a second. So the 10-year period, I believe, ending July this year, or June this year, including carried interest, 93% of the gross alpha has been captured by the manager. So essentially, almost all the value add that has come from this asset class or from this investment has remained with the managers in total, right? And if we look at the previous 10-year period, then it's actually been over 100%, which means that the managers made their money, but you didn't, right? So we definitely think this asset class has a lot of potential to restructure, renegotiate whenever it comes to expiry. And because the performance numbers haven't proven to be what probably was anticipated, there's also a lot of room here to save money, really. Next. Yeah, go to the private equity. Okay. So we've also been asked to give our view on private equity, and we didn't have contracts for private equity, so we really can't give a very detailed view. But we can, from our experience, of course, say that this is an asset class that has high fees. And as fees are high, there is a lot of room to save money. It is in private equity, as has been previously said, difficult to save money once you're invested because you're locked in. So you need to essentially wait for the moment until those come to reinvestment, whether that is with the same firm or with a different firm. And at that point in time, you need to renegotiate your terms very carefully. And we believe that in that asset class alone, there is a potential to save a lot of money for both plans by renegotiating hard at the time of reinvesting those assets. And if we look at the total cost of private equity, and We did have more precise numbers for one plan where it was including carried interest, and which for me clearly is a part of the cost. It was almost 701 basis points. We also realize, however, that out of that number there is only a certain number that can actually be renegotiated. And from our experience in private equity, so that portion that is up for renegotiation is about 300 basis points of total cost that has room for renegotiation. And we believe that if both plans were to renegotiate in those 300 basis points, which don't represent the full cost of the asset class, but the portion of the cost which actually have room for renegotiation, then if both plans renegotiate 10% of savings in those 300 basis points, and that is definitely achievable, then that will do a lot towards your savings target. I will show 2 slides later how much exactly. We have also listed here a few ideas just as some recommendations for the 2 plans of how they could achieve those savings. I'm not going to go into detail here in the interest of time, but we could probably give you 30 pages of guidelines of what to do and not to do when you invest into private equity. But we've given you maybe 10 or 12 bullet points as an indication of where you could start to actually get better terms. And again, we're more than happy to support both plans in that process if they wanted more input for us and maybe share some of our experience that we have had renegotiating those terms. Next. So if we come to the summary of savings potential, this is just to give you an idea of how the 1.51 billion that we believe SIRS can achieve, how that comes about. We later on have the same slide for PSIRS. And again, this is what, from our experience, from having renegotiated a lot of assets in the past, over the past 12 years, and from looking at the portfolio of both SIRS and PSIRS, what do we think can be achieved through renegotiation? And these are the numbers. And essentially for SIRS, we do believe that the 1.51 million over 30 years, they could be achieved. I noticed before that probably that target should have started back in 2017. We weren't aware of that, so we were actually considering that it would start 30 years from now. So there's 1 year missing, essentially. Next slide. For PSIRS, we actually think that the savings potential is quite a bit higher, and this is primarily due to the fact that we believe the high yield allocation that we have mentioned before, where the managers have kept 93% of the gross alpha over the last 10-year period. And we also believe that the asset class is simply overpriced. You can achieve this asset class significantly cheaper. And therefore, when these mandates come to expiry, we believe there is a lot of room to renegotiate that. We, in fact, think there's almost 42 million of renegotiation potential on an annual basis in that asset class alone. And taking those various assumptions together, we believe that PSIRS has the potential of saving up to 4.96 billion over the 30-year time horizon. We had that discussion before, and I was following it carefully on amalgamating plans or investments of the plans, and it is our view that there is additional savings potentials if the 2 plans were to work closer together on their investments. We also think because both plans are already big, those additional benefits are marginal. Right? We have also, in our entire review, not looked at the organizational cost of the 2 plans. We've really just looked at the cost of their external managers. So if there is a potential savings on the organizations, we refrain from make any statements because we don't have any information on that. We can't say. But if we look at the external managers, because both plans are already big, we think, yes, there is some savings potential, but we also think it is not that big. I mean, sorry, to correct that. Those additional savings are still very meaningful, don't get me wrong. But if the renegotiations are done properly, then those are more meaningful than what would come from consolidation of the investments. Thank you. That's it. So I would turn over back to the Commission for questions.
We did it, and we appreciate it. You've come a long way, and you have developed large numbers here, and large numbers oftentimes become sound bites, and we appreciate your expertise in backing up that information. I will forego any questions at this point in time, and I will only ask my fellow commissioners, if they do have a question, to keep it very brief, number one, and number two, to not insert comments, really focus on questions that are important to develop back from the testifiers. So, Mr. Vice Chairman? Thank you. Commissioner Gallagher?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Drs. Monk and Dr. Staub, for being here. I recognize the journeys that you both took to be here today. Again, I also thank you for the recipe. Getting into Thanksgiving season, it's good to have a good cost-saving recipe to go into a family reunion with. So to that point, though, what I'm hearing, and maybe I'm oversimplifying it, is that if we just renegotiate the contracts we have, our partnership agreements with our private equity and hedge firms, we'll achieve these savings over X amount of time. Now, how easy is it to renegotiate? And second, I know you started out talking about how, there's Harvard Business School grads who are experts in negotiation. What chops do you have? What qualifications do you have that can match that? And then second, how many managers, explicitly the ones that PCERS and CERS has currently, have you renegotiated terms with directly?
So the first question, it is, I would think on private equity, achieving 10% savings on those 300 basis points that are up to negotiation, up on time of reinvesting by just being more aware maybe of the terms that you could achieve. I think that is achievable. Achieving the savings with the public equity managers, there's a certain level of uncertainty, right? It's not a guaranteed fee outcome that you will have. And we do have negotiated with some of the managers that both plans have. And we actually also, from experience, we have had a case where we had the same manager, the same allocation, but different clients, and they wouldn't grant us the same terms, although we had the contract in hand and we could show them, you've granted these terms to someone else, and they wouldn't grant it to that other client. So there's no guarantee for that outcome, right? We are, however, fairly highly convinced that these achievements can be made, and therefore these savings are also they're possible. Negotiating them, it's more of an art than a science.
Okay, thank you. So with that, we're going to end the testimony for the first half of the day, if that's fine. But I will ask, number one, I want to announce that there's lunch available for the commissioners and testifiers. We want everyone to keep their strength up. And if it's okay, we're just going to take 1/2 hour for lunch and try and catch up on some of our lost time here. But also, if possible, and there's one or two more questions, would you be available for questions after we return? Great. Okay, excellent. So we will reconvene at 5 minutes after 2. Thank you.